Well, I decided to become a CA a little bit later in life than most people would straight out of school. Originally, I decided to study the marketing route because I was very creative at school, and then I came back from London at about 21, and I decided that I really wanted to do a qualification that had a little bit more gravitas in terms of being able to open up doors to your first job, post articles, etc. So that's when I decided that I wanted to go the CA route, predominantly because it's so well respected, both from a South African perspective and from an international perspective, and it gives you such a well-rounded understanding as to how business works. So I studied through UNISA at Varsity College in Durban, interestingly enough, predominantly because of the fact that Howard College and Durban Westville had merged at that stage, and there was a bit of tumultuous times at that stage. That's the reason I went through UNISA. It took me 3 years to do my undergraduate, because as I mentioned, I studied marketing first, so I got some of the credits there. So it was 3 years including honours, and then I moved to Johannesburg to do my articles at Deloitte. The reason that I did that was because in the hub in Johannesburg, there's so many more options as to what you can do with your CA outside of just the financial management and auditing sphere, and so that was the main reason why I moved up. Originally, when I left Deloitte, I moved to Dimension Data, and I spent a year building up an innovation consulting practice from a Dimension Data perspective, and it was really interesting because I remember the first day that I walked in. Of course, when you're at Deloitte Consulting, it's very much suits and everyone's very slick and knows their stuff 100%, and I walked into a situation where the blinds were all shut, and there was a whole bunch of guys all of a sudden dressed in jeans and wolf pattern t-shirts and slops and long hair and everything else, and the culture was just so fundamentally different in terms of coding and technology. And I spent a year at Data with their sales teams, and also to a large extent with their development teams, and I learned so much in terms of what actually makes tech tick. So what I was able to do then was to merge the business side of things, which I largely had from a Deloitte perspective, with the technology side, and then I got the opportunity to move across to SAP, which I was extremely excited about, because I think SAP has had, especially in South Africa, there's a perception that we largely sell ERP software, where actually it makes up less than 30% of our global revenue, and there is so much more that we're doing. We've been on a huge acquisition trail, moving into the artificial intelligence space, into natural language processing, and we acquired a couple of companies that do that last year. We spent over $2 billion USD in the IoT space, and it's really interesting as to how all of those things are starting to come together and converge. I think it's also very interesting that people speak a lot about digital, and digital being all the buzzwords that we normally hear about. How do you use blockchain? How do you use the Internet of Things? How do you use machine learning? But actually what we see, and what I've certainly come to understand to a large extent from my SAP experience, is that digital is really about being able to process large pieces of data in real time very quickly. So without that ability to process information and query it at the same time, which is a fundamentally technology-based discussion, you actually can't do digital. You can't do machine learning. It doesn't matter what insights you get. If you only get them 3 months later, you're not going to be able to respond in real time. The same thing with the Internet of Things component. So that's really the crux of what has driven the digital revolution that we know it now as. It's a little bit less sexy than the usual buzzwords, but it is fundamentally important. On the other scale end of things, from an SAP perspective, we are, at the moment, there's a lot of new grassroots banks that are opening up all over the South African landscape. We obviously know we've got one of the most progressive financial services and banking economies in the world, but a lot of what you're starting to see in the marketplace is actually underpinned by what we're able to do from an SAP perspective. And it really is, if you start to relook completely at the way that we do banking, and how we are able to influence that from a technology perspective and rethink it all together, I think you're able to start to see banks that are run on much more lean situations with far fewer employees on the mundane day-to-day tasks, but more being able to focus them on what does your customer actually want and need, and how can you start to influence their behavior in a positive light.